Alright, hello and welcome to Gameplay Week for Digital Game Design. This is going to be the first of a short series of videos. I'm trying to break them up into smaller chunks so that they're easy to digest. And so this is going to be your introduction, because gameplay is a pretty broad topic and there's not really a good way to cover everything in one day or one course or one video. So we're going to break it down into a bunch of different parts. And at its core, gameplay is very simple, right? Gameplay is what happens when a player is encountering choices in a game, they're encountering challenges, or they're encountering consequences in some kind of virtual environment. And each of these challenges or choices would have a lot of different possibilities, a lot of different possible strategies or outcomes for players. Things that the players can do to overcome or surpass those challenges or those choices. And this kind of core piece, this gameplay interaction, is why, it's often why players will find a game fun, or at least why players will find that game compelling. And as you know from previous discussions on formal and dramatic elements, gameplay is generally governed by the rules of the game. So I'm not going to go over that part again. You can go back to those lectures if you need a refresher on that piece. The bulk of what I want to talk about in this video is interactivity, which is a big piece in and of itself. So I've adapted some of this content from a blog post and combined it with kind of my own insight. But if you want more information, especially for a more multiplayer context, feel free to check this link out. We care about interactivity because interactivity is a core part of kind of those core game loops that we design and we build our games around. So as you're thinking about this stuff, keep in mind what you know about rules, how those rules affect kinds of gameplay, and how those kind of internal interactions are being afforded or are manifesting. But we'll get there. So, interactivity. Again, we kind of touched on it when we were talking about players. We're thinking about how our players are interacting with our game system. And when we think about interactivity in the context of gameplay, we can kind of break it down into three big categories. Interactions between the player and the game itself. We think about interactions between a player and other players, and we think about interactions between players and the platform that they are using. And the easiest one to think about, and the one that we think about the most often, is that player-to-game interaction. Very simply, when a player is interacting with the game itself or with the systems in the game. And you can think back to our systems lecture about how all of those relationships apply here as we move forward. Generally, as I said, this is kind of the most common form of interactivity in gameplay, and we think about player-to-game interactions as relationships between players and AI within the game, players and their spatial reasoning, spatial representation, and how that manifests in the game. We think about how players interact with their perception of the atmosphere of the game. And of course, generally the game environment and the content within the game. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to briefly kind of touch on each of these kinds of relationships. So first of all, we can think about relationships between players and AI. These are interactions between players and NPCs, players and enemies, but also this is how a player understands how, or what falls into this category is things like how a player understands how NPCs or how enemies work. And it's this kind of perception and understanding is key, because knowing how players perceive things can lead to really interesting gameplay on a lot of different levels. And so pictured here, I've got a strategy game. So if you think of strategy games like Fire Emblem, or what I have pictured here is Shining Force, sure, these are fun as like RPGs, but they also offer the player the ability to explore a depth of strategies through learning and understanding how the enemies in these games behave, and kind of like how they target other units and what kind of skills they prioritize. So that's a really interesting interaction to be able to play around with and to help set up for our players. Next, we can talk about spatial representation and mapping. This includes things like kind of the understanding of space within games like Tetris, where we're trying to align different things using those kind of alignment-based goals or objectives, and simply our players' understanding of the physical space in the game and how areas connect to one another. So this can be objective-based. These can be objective-based interactions or navigation-based interactions. More often than not, they're navigation-based, but really it depends on the game and the kind of game that we're building. Next, we can think about our players' perception of the game's atmosphere. And I think, again, perception is kind of the key word here, because we as designers and developers in general, we set up what we think is going to deliver the kind of core experience that we're after, right? But really what matters at the end of the day is how a player perceives what we set up. And so a great example of this kind of like maybe mismatch between perception or an illustration of why that player's perception is important is kind of, so I've got pictured here a game called Phantasmagoria 2. It's an old FMV point and click puzzle adventure, but this is billed as like a horror game. It's supposed to be very scary and very spooky. And something about, an office environment with purple walls that's brightly lit and like this pose and style of main character just does not evoke that feeling of terror. And so it's really important to think about how or make sure that you're doing atmosphere in a way that is going to evoke the kind of gameplay that you want players to be experiencing. Because in this case here, and I can't remember where it came from, but I remember a quote related to this game where the person reviewing it or playing it was saying, hey, I don't care what kind of music you play, an office cubicle is not scary. So food for thought, I suppose. Okay. Sorry, I thought I was moving on. Still talking about atmosphere. A better example of the kind of atmosphere, or like building atmosphere that kind of evokes the right kind of experience, or the kind of experience that developers or designers are trying to give. You could look at how Firewatch presents itself. Lighting, music, all of these things convey a lot of different moods that then are able to kind of effectively reach the player. So this could be, calm serenity of the wilderness. At other times, the visuals, the music can evoke a sense of loneliness. They can evoke a sense of panic. And this is something that, you can reasonably determine and tweak through playtesting. But by and large, I think you have a lot of experience with like playing games and thinking about your own experiences, that you can start drawing lines to things that will aid you in constructing your own believable atmospheres as well. But of course, finally, we can think about the actual game content, and this can be anything in between. So all of the interactions and feedback between the player's actions as well as the game response to them. So all of these kind of like 4 categories are really what you're looking at when we're thinking about interactivity that's happening between the player and the game. And the next thing of 3 that we're going to talk about is interactivity between the player and other players. And we can think about this like, okay, cool, how is the PvP set up and stuff like that. Player-to-player interactivity is not necessarily just the way players can play with or play against each other. I also want you to be thinking about the ways that players communicate and the way that players connect with each other in that virtual space. And this can come down to, even the nature of how players are cooperating or how they're competing, whether they're working together in one team, working together in a number of teams, and similarly with how they're competing, whether they're working together or working against each other in one team versus one team versus multiple other teams, all kinds of different ways that players can interact together. And I think it's important to say here, when we're thinking about player-to-player interactions, as designers, this is where things kind of get a little bit murky for us, because when we build the game, we're creating the framework, right? We give the players the opportunity, the potential to interact with other players. It's not always so easy to predict how players are going to act in that space that we're providing for them. And this can get even more difficult on hardware like the PC, where there's sometimes incentive within gaming communities to allow modding support, and sometimes that often changes the way that the game works so that players can interact with one another. So you can see there's a lot of different ways, again, through cooperation, competition, communication, that players can talk to each other, whether it's voice, text, whether it's teams, whether it's PvP. I challenge you for something like this to think back to, again, our talks on systems design and kind of what the possibilities within these spaces are. So like the player-to-player interaction in a game like Terraria is going to be very and vastly different than the player-to-player interaction in a game like Mario Kart, or in a kind of cooperative beat-em-up like Scott Pilgrim or the Streets of Rage games. And so again, that also falls under this kind of large umbrella of what is gameplay, not just how a player is interacting with the game, but also how they're interacting and how that interaction is facilitated with other players in multiplayer games, of course. Lastly, the other part of gameplay you can examine and you can look at and you can design for is the player-to-platform interactions. And this is kind of on a higher level, how the player is interacting with the hardware and software of the game. And this can include the graphics capabilities of the hardware, the sound capabilities of the hardware, what input devices the player is using, and in some cases, memory, battery, storage, things like that. For where you're at in your game development career and where the space is currently, like what the landscape of game development is right now, I think input devices is still kind of the big one that we'd be thinking about. Because, I mean, Ring Fit is somewhat recent. Nintendo has a kind of a history of exploring with interesting input devices or kind of controller attachments. But also as the VR space is expanding, we're thinking about how input in VR works, and how to do things like haptics and all that other stuff in a more true virtual space, let's say. And certainly it can get interesting when you think about graphics and sound capabilities, thinking about visual or auditory interactions as far as like communicating information. This can get as low level as audio quality, frame rates, response times, and even like metagame interactions. I want to highlight these, at least in this slide, just again to give you something to think about, because as designers, especially as novice designers, we're not really thinking about that hardware piece as much. But yeah, so practically, let's say we're designing a competitive multiplayer game. One of the things that's maybe important to think about is, we want to design a game such that using certain graphical settings or certain sound settings doesn't give one player a significant advantage over another, because maybe we really value fair competition. And so that's when these kind of things might come into play. So that's kind of the three big, let's say, pieces: player to game interactions, player to player interactions, and player to platform interactions. Now let's dive a little bit deeper. And I think this next piece falls closer to those player to game interactions, but let's kind of like break it down and specify. So we can think about every game as just a series of really small, very quick interactions. And in single player, which is the easiest way to break this process down, most of those interactions are between the player and the game itself. And so it takes the form of this really, really rapid conversation where we have the player performing some action. Typically, this is like pressing a button on their input device, moving the mouse, pressing the D-pad, whatever. And then the game has an opportunity to respond to that, right? So as the game system determines a response to that piece of input or that action, that response is communicated to the player. The player sees something change on screen. And again, this happens very, very, very quickly. This is all those like infinitely small pieces of moment-to-moment gameplay. And in general, once you kind of expand this to multiplayer, I don't think that I want to get into that too much. But in general, this becomes kind of a big reciprocating loop between players where a player sees kind of that response from the game system, analyzes the information. So, okay, what has changed? Maybe what has changed is my character has jumped. Maybe what's changed is I've taken damage or something else has taken damage. But again, in that moment to moment, the player first analyzes information to determine what their next action will be. So then they act on that information, performing that next action. The game, as kind of shown back here, determines a response to what that action is. And the response is based upon how your feedback is set up, and kind of largely based within the rule framework of your game, right? That's the kind of the bones of the whole structure. And then kind of where it gets, when you add other players in, this is when other players would try to kind of go to that analyzing step and say, okay, well, what has happened? And now I need to formulate my own actions. And again, you can add more and more players to this, but that would mean that this diagram would get much more complicated. I have another version of it that I'll show you in second year when we start thinking more and more about multiplayer interactions. But in general, for now, for your information, this kind of loop goes back and forth between players, whether it's one player or multiple players, until that game is over. And the speed at which these interactions happen is actually relevant to your design. Different speeds of interaction fit better with different types of designs. So if you think of games like Civilization, that's a very slow-paced game. The space between those interactions is quite large, right? You might only have a single interaction from a player every few minutes. And this slow pace really affords players to use a lot more strategy in the way that they're playing the game. In Civilization, the reason those interactions are spaced so far apart is because there's a lot of information to analyze in that space. So it's not just like, hey, what's immediately happening? It might be like, what resources do I have available? What are my opponents doing? And kind of looking around the map for kind of the next best move for a player. And so that slower interaction speed does afford a much finer approach to that strategic element of the game. On the other hand, games like Counter-Strike, those of you that are playing Valorant maybe is a better example here, or a more relevant one, is much more fast-paced. In these cases, the space between interactions is very small, and so it becomes very, very important that players have some kind of aptitude or let's say twitch skill or reaction speed. And again, kind of the more interactions that happen, or the more quickly those interactions happen, the more information actually gets generated for players to analyze, because again, the game is responding to all of these things, and the game state is constantly updating, which is why, or which can lead to those kind of like big, let's say, mechanical skill gaps in these kind of like competitive FPS games, your Valorants, your Apex Legends, your Titanfalls. For those of you that want to keep telling me that Titanfall 2 is better, it's fine, I know, but yeah. Basically, the change as designers, as we change the expected spacing between our gameplay interactions, this can lead to different forms of play, whether this is real-time play or asynchronous play. And this is stuff that, again, I think we get into a little bit more next year, but now I want to make sure that you have a primer to think about how you do this, and realize that the speed at which you're asking players to interact with your game is going to fundamentally change the way that the game feels and the way that the game plays, and also have an effect on what kinds of strategy or pacing your game actually affords. And so to round out this video, it's a little bit longer than I wanted it to be already. Just want to give you a couple other like low-level types of interaction to think about, and you can think about how these fit into the idea of gameplay and how these affect gameplay. So first is spatial avatar interaction, where you have two or more avatars or player characters interacting with one another. This is fairly simple, right? This is shooting other players in Valorant or Apex Legends. This could be following another player around the space in a game like Journey. Just acting with avatars in the game space. Next is spatial environment interaction. Players interacting with their immediate environment. This is really easy to see in Minecraft, where players can build or destroy elements of the environment, moving them around or using them for other purposes. Decoration and display are interactions centered around players signaling their status or their affiliations. This is kind of like how players decorate their weapons or their pets or their houses in games that have systems that afford those kinds of things. Economic interactions, these are your buying and selling either to NPCs or to other players. Giving, trading, paying for resources, any kind of currency-based, or let's say currency-based. It's a little bit more broad than that, but for ease of explaining it, let's say currency-based types of interactions. There are, of course, text-based interactions. This is how you, or is usually the most common way of introducing some kind of language into games. Usually text-based interactions are done in online games, of course. It's really low cost. It's easy to send text-based information through the network. But of course, like, this is centered on communication, and this is the beginning of thinking about communication-based interactions, because in addition to text, you can also use voice. This adds nuance to those communication style interactions, and you can communicate through voice. Emotion, in some cases age, in some cases gender is conveyed through voice. Certainly there are limits within vocal communication in terms of like group size and how many people are talking, or how many NPCs are talking at once. But there are also a lot of weaknesses with voice as well. Obviously, it's harder to transfer than text. It's harder to filter out. So, again, something just to be aware of. And finally, in very, very specific scenarios, body language might also be a gameplay interaction between a set of players. This only happens really in local spaces. So we're not seeing a lot of this right now. But when you're playing with your friends around or when players are playing with their friends around a table or at a couch or something, there are other communicative pieces that can come into place here: facial expression, body language, physical presence, the way that a person is sitting or standing, also communicates information and can be used in a game. In some cases, you'd have gesture control. In others, it's strictly for player-to-player interaction, whether players are trying to show or assert dominance or what have you. Again, as far as this is concerned, this is still really just interesting things to think about, harder to design for things like body language. But all of these other things certainly relevant to think about when you're designing those I don't want to say relevant again, but those relevant aspects of your game. And that's it for the first video. I think this is going to be the longest one. The other ones will be much shorter. But this is a bit of a primer into gameplay. Yeah, so if you have questions, bring them to class. Otherwise, feel free to take a look through the other videos, and I will see you in class.